Welcome everybody to the Flow Party Fridays. We used to do this every Friday, but because now we have a cohort running, we're a little bit busy, making sure that that is flowing nicely and all of the students are learning as much as they can. But I'm trying to get this back on the run every Friday again. And this is the sort of like the second party that we've done in the last couple months. But today's party is going to be really cool because it's going to be about Webflow basics. We're going to be covering all of the basic stuff from Webflow that I feel every developer or visual designer should know when they start creating a project on Webflow. So let's get started. Webflow basics. So everything on the web, as you know, or as you don't know, is made out of boxes. So everything you see on a website is a box inside of a box. And it's sort of like that Russian doll that it's just like the bigger doll, and then inside you have all of the little dolls inside. So the web works exactly the same way. So as you can see in this little diagram that I did, when you see a website and you see, for example, the logo is wrapped inside a box. And then inside that box is another box, which would be the image. So even the elements that are actually a thing are considered a box, and they can be sized, they can be aligned, they can be positioned, they can be styled, however you want. But the main message that I want you to understand is that everything is a box within a box. So when we see a box, we see that we can add some type of spacing around it. And the first spacing that I want to cover is padding. So padding is the space inside of the box. And margin is the space outside of the box. So let's say that you have two boxes, each one has a padding of 2 rem or 20 pixels. And in between those boxes, you want to add some type of spacing. So that would be the margin. And let's say that the margin also has a 2 rem or 20 pixel space. Then let's go into a little bit of HTML and CSS so you can understand how this basically is laid out on the web. So as you can see, Craigslist is a really good example of HTML. So what you see here is pure HTML with very little CSS. Everything is basically how it's rendered on the web. So when you add for example, a heading 2, this is basically the standard HTML tag on the web without any styling, meaning without any CSS. And this would be just the normal paragraph element. That's just the raw version of how they look. Obviously, as I said, there's some type of styling on this, but it's very minimal. And this is what would happen if we didn't add any CSS to a website. Now, if we see a website design sort of like an X-ray mode, I was actually trying to do this on Webflow to see like the X-ray of the box model inside of a real website, but I think that feature is gone. And if anybody knows if it's not gone, please let me know, because I think it's a really good feature and I used to use it a lot. But basically, if you do an X-ray on your website, this is more or less what it would look like. So all of the little tags here would be your HTML tags. So meaning that your hero starts in a big box, then you start adding little boxes inside, like the heading wrap and the tagline wrap. And inside of those wraps, you can add your tags, your H1s, your paragraphs, your H2s. And then if we go a little bit more complex, we can start to see the cards. So as you can see from the example, previous example, you can see that we have 2 cards, each one with a padding and a margin in between. So we want to make sure to give it a little bit of breathing room, and that's what we can do with padding. Inside of those boxes, so we can add our first div, our second div, which would be wrapping the heading, and our third div, which would be wrapping the copy. And finally, if we want to add a button, we can create it with a div, or we can actually create it with a button tag, HTML tag. I do know that Webflow, I don't know if they have changed this, but Webflow doesn't have a button HTML tag for some reason, if I'm not wrong. So usually what I do is I just create them with a div, and then that way I can add little icons or images inside of the boxes. And finally, add just a link block. So this is basically how you would see the X-ray version of a website with just HTML. But what happens when we want to see it with styling, meaning with CSS? That's where the design actually comes in. So with the styling, we can actually add color, we can add styling on the cards, we can add positioning, alignment, typography styles, and everything we want. And this is like the reason why Webflow for designers is so great. So let me change my screen, because now we're going to go straight to Webflow. So when we start a project, we want to make sure that everything that we create is with clean code. Clean code means that we don't want to add unnecessary classes when they're not really needed onto an element. One of the main issues or mistakes that I see from beginners, and this happened to me, was like trying to reuse an element or trying to just dump as much CSS on top of it just to create a desired style. And that is just a huge no, because the only thing that's going to do is it's just going to make your site like super heavy in code. The first thing that I want to talk about is the structure of a site. So remember that everything is with boxes inside of boxes. So the first thing that I would do would be to add a div block, which would be sort of like the outer box of everything. So I would call that a page wrapper. And usually that page wrapper has very little styling to it, because this would be like the mother container that's going to hold all of the content inside of this page. Now, for the sake of this project, because this is actually the Eurecah website that I copied, and we're going to be like getting some examples from here, I'm going to duplicate this class and I'm going to change the name. So page wrapper lesson, I don't know. So as you can see, we don't have any sort of styling to it except for a width, which is 100%, and a position to relative. Now, one of the things that it's really important to understand is the styling that you can add in Webflow. So the first thing that I want to talk about is layout. Layout is this first block of content that you see here on the right, where my cursor is. So let's add a div block inside of the page wrapper lesson. We're going to drop our div block, and this is going to be our first box. So let's say that this is going to be our hero parent. Now, another thing that I was seeing on the cohort were the naming of the classes. Usually, we want to make sure that the naming convention of our website makes sense not only for us, but for the client. So yes, you can call it hero space parent, but by default, your code will be rewritten by writing it hero-parent. And on top of that, I really like to shorten my words just so it's like the code doesn't become like super long. So this is what I write, and it has worked for me, and usually clients do understand it. Again, you can call it like this and there's no problem, but I would say always add a dash or an underscore. Obviously, if you're using FinSuite, Mast, or any other framework, they already have pre-made class names and you can follow that structure. But if you are creating something from scratch, this is how I would recommend for you to write your classes. Another thing is think about hierarchy. So remember, box model. You're going from the biggest box to the smallest box. And it's basically like a family. So think about your page wrapper would be just like the main thing. But then after that, think about it like parent, the child, which goes inside of the parent. And then after that, then you can start creating your components inside of that child. You know what I mean? And I will show you how that works. But always think about hierarchy because it's easier to structure your layouts that way and just keep everything consistent throughout all of the pages of your project. So now that we have our first hero parent here, which would be, you know, the first thing that we're gonna, or I guess the thing before the next one that we're gonna start styling, we're gonna add styling to this component. But before that, let's add another div. So this one would be the hero child. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to add some styling to this. So I want to make sure that this component, the hero parent, spans 100% of the width of the screen. Why am I not using pixels in this component? Because I don't want to restrain the growth of this container. I want to make sure that the container always spans 100% of the screen. And this is really important on web design because the screens change all the time of size. If somebody may have a 1920 screen, the other one could be a 1720 whatever, a 1472. So all the screens are always changing. So using percentages is a great option so that container always responds to the screen size. And then on the height, I want to use 100 viewport height, which means that it's going to cover the full height of the screen. Now, when we talk about layout, we have all of these options. The block option will always take the full width and will always just cascade down from the left. And then we go into flex. Now, flex sets their children on a horizontal or vertical axis. So this will be probably the one that you will use the most. And usually, if you want to center something in the middle, you can just simply click here and you can see our hero child div sets right there on the middle. But you have other options. You can position it to the left. You can position it to the right. If you have more than one element inside, you can set space in between. So for example, we can duplicate this element. And if we stand on the parent, because remember that we're styling the parent, we're not styling the children inside. If we stand on the parent and we say, actually, 1 second. Yeah. Give me some space in between, then you can see that they're going to be spread apart. And if we say, give me space around, it's going to still push it to the middle, but it's going to give space around the elements. So there will be cases in which you will notice that that is necessary. But for this example, we're just going to keep it simple and make this hero child go in the middle. So as you can see, whatever that you want to manipulate inside of that main box, or I guess this is not the main box, but like the hero box, will need to be edited on that parent, not on the child. So a site, like the difference between, for example, Figma, where you can just grab an element and slide it from one side to the other. In web design, you actually manipulate the parent so you can tell the child what to do. So in this hero element, let's say that we want to add some text. So semantically, in your hero, you should always have a heading 1. Why? Because this is what the indexing will read first. So for example, in the accessibility world, if you are, for example, blind, and you can't really see the website, what the indexing will read first will be an H1. After that, it will read the H2 and the H3 and the H4 and so on. So it's really important for you to have these type of tags in order so you can make your site accessible. Okay, so let's say that we want to add a style to this heading, because right now, obviously, we can't see it because on my style guide, I set that up to have all of the headings in the color black. So what we do is we go ahead and we give our heading a class, heading 1. So by default, don't pay attention to this because obviously this is inheriting from my style guide, but what I'm gonna do is I'm going to make sure to give it a color first because I can't see anything. And then I'm gonna give it a font. I'm gonna choose the weight. And do I want it bold? Yeah. And then I can just type what I wanted to say. So what if I want this element to be positioned on the bottom? So what I do is I go back to my hero parent, I go back to my layout settings, and I just push this to the bottom. I'm not giving it any padding because I just want it to be, to the bottom. In web design, you have different types of measurements for sizing. You have pixel, REM, EM, percentages, viewport width, viewport height. So there's like many sort of sizing that you can add to your elements. Pixels would be the absolute unit or measurement that you can use for all of your designs, and it's good, but it's not what it's called relative. So for example, if someone goes into their phone and changes the default size of how things should be laid out on their browser, your design will not adjust to that root sizing. So the root standard default sizing for all of the browsers is 16 pixels. When you use, for example, REM is actually sizing itself based on the root. So it's taking that 16 pixels and multiplying it by the size of your REM unit. So for example, if we have here 4, multiply that by 16. So REM is usually what I use. So your design will be affected by that root sizing. Now, EMs, it's a little bit more complicated because EMs is taking not only the size of the element. So let's say that we use 4 EM. It is not only multiplying it by the root, but it's also multiplying by the parent element that it's also using an EM unit. So if you don't really know how to, if you don't have to take those things into consideration, EM could really blow up on your face if someone decides to change their default sizing on their browser. So I would say use it with caution. I like REM, it works for me, and I really suggest that you work with REM. Now, another nice unit is viewport width for websites that are bold. So if we take, for example, the Eurecah site, you can see that we have a big block of text here in the bottom. Now, if we were using pixels or REM, you take the risk that the sizing of the heading doesn't really cover the full screen, and that is the vibe that we're going for this type of website. So what I would suggest, or what I would do in this situation, would be to size this element with VW. And what it does is that it's always going to cover the viewport width of that screen. It will make sure that no matter the size of the screen, it will always respond to the size of it. So this is a great unit when we're thinking about responsiveness for really big titles. And this is also what we did on the hero parent. You see that we added the 100% viewport height because we always wanted to make sure to cover the 100% of the viewport height. So let's say that we want to create a layout like this, and we want to use the grid type of layout. So if we go back to our wrapper, the main wrapper, this is, remember, where everything's going to be sort of like contained. Inside of our page wrapper lesson, we're gonna add another div block, and then this div block, we're gonna call it about parent. So this is going to be our second section. Now, because we are using div blocks and we want to make sure that semantically the website is laid out correctly, we're going to use our tags here on the settings, and we're going to give it the tag of section. So our HTML is nice and clean and we can lay everything out correctly. And if we go into the second one, we're going to change it to section, and we're going to leave it like that. Cool. Okay, so on the hero parent, we use flex. On this one, why don't we use grid? So if you see the layout here, we have an element that is on the far left top corner. Then we have this element that's sort of like off onto the side. And then we have this final element, which is all the way to the bottom. If we used a flex layout here, it would basically push everything to the right or to the left or centered. So we need to make sure to understand this layout. And the best way to do that is by wrapping everything into a grid and then dividing it into columns and rows. So let's go back to Webflow. So we have our grid here on the display settings. And by default, the grid is going to be 2 columns and 2 rows. And if we see here, we can see that we have 1, 2, and 3 rows. So let's make sure to have 3 rows. So as you can see, we have 3 rows. So if you think about the design, we already know that we have the number here, we have the text here, and then we have that final element here on the side. So if we leave it without any type of styling, let's just keep it simple first, because this is what I used to do when I was learning Webflow. I didn't used to style things at the beginning. I just used to like stack things, and then after that, I would style it, because it's easy. It was easier for me to understand it. So let's add a div block to create that first element, which is the number. So we have our div block, and we're going to call it large number. And then inside of this, we're going to be adding a text block, and this is going to be the large number. And let's change the color so we can see it. We're going to make this 10. And I just want to keep it at 1. So let's just restyle this. Did it have a dash? Yes, it did have a dash. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to do it normal. Like, I'm not going to do anything like complicated, just so you can see how to just work with the layout. So it could look a little bit intimidating, but I swear that after you kind of like get the hang of it, it's super simple. So we have our first component there. Let's add a second div block, and by default, it's going to fall on the next space, so on the next column. And this one, it's going to be called about parent. This is where our text is. So we know that we have a little helper text here that says the north of, or the ethos of Eurecah. And then we're gonna see, we see the text, and then we see the button. So we have 3 elements within that about parent element. So let's add that. The first thing, I'm going to press Command E, and I'm gonna search for, do we want to wrap that into a div block? Maybe not. So let's just go straight into text block. So this one is going to be helper text, and I'm just gonna call it like this, helper text. And this is going to be sort of like a dim gray, and it's gonna be capitalized, and that is it. So let's just call it north. And it had this brackets, north, and that's it. Cool. So we have our helper text there. If we click here and we go into the parent, the about parent, we can drop our following text. So let's not wrap it in anything. In this one, I'm going to use the paragraph element, and I'm going to call this about text. So this element, or this block of text, was using ITC Garamond, and it was using this one, if I'm not wrong. The text was pretty big, so let's use 3. Let's not add any text for now. Let's just keep it as it is. So right then and there, we can see that the layout is starting to take shape. So let's just compare it here. Okay, so you can see that there's a big space here on the bottom to create that sort of like off balance design. And the way we can do that is by extending this element all the way to the right. So then this element falls onto the next row. So let's see if we can do that. So this text is going to go all the way here. And then this text, what we're gonna do is we're gonna go down and we're gonna tell it to go manual. And then we're gonna go into the second column. I want it to start at the second column, end at the second column. And let's go back here. And that's it. We don't want it to go all the way to the third row. So as you can see, we have row 1, row 2, row 3. Composition wise, you see that it makes sense. Like we have this empty space, and then we have this empty space. Lastly, we're gonna press Command E, and we're gonna add our next div block. We're gonna make it manual, and we're gonna tell it to start at 1, end at 1, but start at row 3 and end at row 3. So right there, we have our 3 rows already filled out. This is going to be called slider P. For now, let's add just an image. And if we look here, we can search for that image right here. So by default, it's going to take the full width and height of the image. So what we're gonna do here is we're gonna add a little sizing to this. We want to make sure that we have a set width and a set height. So I want to talk about alignment within a grid. So let's say that we want this element, the slider P, to move to the right of this column. So what we do is we have a set of options here within the grid to align and justify elements. So if we want to move that element to the right, we just press end, and the box will move to the end of that column. And the same if we want to push it to the other side. Cool. We already have the layout set up, just like how we had it here. We're missing the button. So let's just create a little button. So remember that we had this about parent element with all of this inside. So one of the things that we can do here, because right now the layout that we have set up is display block. We want to make sure that it's display flex and direction vertical, because I want to start adding some gap measurements in between each element. So let's say that we want to add a 2 rem spacing in between. If we press Command E and add a link block for a button, you can see that it automatically adds that spacing. So let's call this button lesson. Let's add some stuff inside. So we're gonna add a text block and we're gonna call this learn more. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna style it with the parent, not with the element. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start adding a little bit of padding. This is usually like the amount of padding that I like to give to my buttons. But obviously it depends on the style of the site and everything, but yeah, just if you want to use something like that, you can. Now, as you can see, well, you're gonna see what's gonna happen now. So we don't want any background color or anything. We do want it to be rounded, and we want to add a border. So let's add a color to this. Let's unlink it and make it 50% opacity. And then the text, I want it to be white and I want it to be capitalized, and I don't want that decoration inside. So right then and there, we have our button. But if we see how it's laid out, we can see that everything is stretched out. And it's because we haven't given it a alignment to the left. So that's what we're gonna do now. So we're gonna stand on our parent. You can see here that on the x-axis, which is the horizontal alignment, you have horizontal alignment on the x and vertical alignment on the y. So for us to make sure that this doesn't cover the whole screen, we're just gonna press one time, and as you can see, it aligns it to the left. What do you think it's missing here? I feel like this element, this about parent element, is too much to the ends. So what do we do in this situation? We're gonna add a little bit of padding inside of all of the sides of this element to make sure that we add some breathing room in here. So usually the top and the bottom have a little bit more breathing room, or at least that's what I like to do. So let's add 4 REM to the top. Then let's add 4 REM to the bottom, and then 2 REM to the sides. We have our layout done, and that's basically how you use grids. Super simple. It's great for editorial style layouts. So we covered alignment, we covered layout, we covered CSS, HTML, spacing, padding, all of that stuff. We're gonna go back into our page wrapper, and let's say that we now want to display our projects, because this is obviously a portfolio site. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're going to drop a div block, and this is going to be called work parent. In here, what we want to do is we want to create a full screen layout to display our project. So what we're gonna do here, first thing is we're going to give it a width of 100%. We want to cover the whole width. And then we want to cover the whole height. So 100 viewport height, right? Inside of this parent, we want to make sure to have an image, because this is going to be our cover. So if we go to the Eurecah site, you can see that the next section is the project. We're gonna make it maybe a little bit different in case you want to just display the full image. So let's do that. So we have our work parent set at 100% width and 100% viewport height. And then inside of that, Command E, we're gonna add another div block. So this div block is going to contain the image of the project. Let's call this work image, and then I'm gonna add the underscore P. So work image parent. What I wanna do on this situation is, I'm thinking, okay, I want this to be the parent of the image, and I'm gonna tell you why. So we're gonna give it 100% width, 100% height, and then on top of that, I want to make sure that the overflow is hidden. And this is where we go into overflow. if you think about how the web is made, what you see right now is just a square. But the cool thing about this is that if we add an image and we make that image 100% width and 110% height, and we make the fit of it cover, and let's drop an image, 1 sec. In web, we can see that it's only a square, but in reality, when you add overflow hidden to the parent element of an image, for example, you can actually hide things outside of the screen. So if we go to Figma, let's take this example. What we were seeing on Webflow was this screen, right? When you add overflow hidden, you can actually hide things outside of the screen. So it would basically look like this. Why is this interesting? Because when you are animating things, so for example, when you see something that just kind of like wipes in, and it just comes from the outside of the screen, that's what overflow hidden allows us to do. And you can do this with not only panels of colored div blocks, but you also can do it with headings, text. Everything is basically hidden underneath that overflow hidden parent. Okay.
Hey, Melissa, I wanted to point something out that
Yeah.
I noticed in the code. So if you were to select your image fill that you're currently on, right? The child, that parent that you're in, right? If you go to settings, it's good thing to remember is like when you have these images here, this image will always, when you put a new image, the CSS is going to build a new image tag inside your CSS. So in order to avoid that, when you go back to styles, and you go up into the selectors in the style selector and go to all images, right? And you tell it not to you could set your settings to be 100% here. Like you see how you have your default here, like you have your default at 100%.
Yeah.
Right. So that's a good way of doing that, because what happens is every time you do it again, if you put in a new image in there, like a new image asset, it's going to build a new CSS with the same information. So if you have 1,000 images, you're going to have 1,000 CSS style selectors with the same information.
Yep.
But
Exactly. And what that's going to do is it's just going to make your website heavier with more CSS. And that's what we're trying to avoid. We want to have the least amount of CSS. Why sometimes input fields get restricted? Oh, because I had already given it a style. So you see how in here I have it in blue. So if I remove that and I go back to images, it's not overridden. So those are some of the things that you have to make sure to keep it clean. So if I have given my HTML tag of all images 100% width and 100% height, then when we create the image fill class, I don't have to give it anymore. Now, because I want to add an animation to this image, I want to make it 110% viewport height. And now if I go back to my HTML, you can see that it overwrites it because I have given a different value to the height. I don't have to do it right now, so let's just keep it on 100. But I wanted to show you that 110 value because from what I showed you on Figma, when we add the animation, we can create that beautiful parallax effect where you kind of like feel like the image is moving on scroll up and down. But that's something for another lesson. So let's keep it simple. So we have our image here. Now, let's talk about positioning. So we covered the overflow hidden. I feel like I don't want to confuse you guys with more overflow settings. So let's keep that overflow on hold now. And maybe in other lessons, we'll talk more about other options. But let's talk about positioning. Positioning is one of those things on web design that are a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible. If we go back to our styles panel and we see the section here that says position, We know that we have static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. So relative basically positions a element relative to the elements around it. And absolute positions an element around that relative component. And I'm going to show you what that means. So let's say that we want to make a component absolute. Let's give this another size. So let's give it a 50% width and 50% height, just so we can see what happens. So this element positioned absolute is going to be positioned absolute to the next element that is set to relative. If we make this parent from static to relative, you can right away see that the element is positioned within that component that is relative. So when you position an element absolute, you should always position the parent as relative. So you can make it go around that wrapper. So let me explain. Now we have settings for this element. So right now, by default, it positions it on the top left. But let's say we want it on the top right. We can just press here. Now, I want to make sure that this element takes the full screen. So I want to make sure that this is full, and we're going to make it, again, 100 width and 100 height. Now, why do I want it absolute? Because if we didn't have this absolute, let's make it back static, and let's add a div. You see how right away it's going to start stacking on the bottom because our parent is set to block. So everything is going to be falling on top of each other by default. Now, if we make this work image parent again absolute and we make it full, we can see right away that our next div block for the heading is going to be sitting on the layer in front of this image. So that's exactly what we want. So this is going to be the project heading. And I want to make sure that that is centered. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the parent element, because remember, we want to edit the children inside. But you know what? So you can see it. Let me just add a heading here. Now, remember that we had a H1 on the hero. So now this one is going to be an H2. Now you can see that we actually can't see the element, and that is because we want to make sure that the C index, so the order of the layers, is organized correctly. So we know that the image, we want it to be the furthest back and the project heading the closest. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to position, and we're going to make this element relative. Because it's relative to the parent element, right away it brings it to the front and the image wrapper to the back. Now let's say that we wanted the image to the front. We go into the C index settings and we bump that up to 1, and right away the image is to the front, but we don't want that. So let's just reset it. So I want to make sure that this heading is positioned in the middle. So what do? We go to the parent element. So what is the parent element of the project heading? It is the work parent, which you can see here on the bottom. So we're going to stand on the work parent, and we're going to give it a flex, and we're going to make it to the center. And that's it. So now let's style this heading 2. And we're going to give it a color of white. I'm going to leave it like this because on the next class, I want to teach you guys how to create a CMS collection for your projects. Yeah. Okay, so is there a way to clean up unused classes? Yes. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so if you go to this tab here, which is style selectors, you can see a little broom here. You can just click here and remove the classes that are not used. And you can do the same with interactions. So if you go here, There's also a broom here. If there are any interactions that you're not using, you can click there and erase them as well.
You know, the one update I was hoping for Webflow to do is that it will recognize, let's say if you have two projects and you're happy with the structure of your first project, now you're starting a new one, and be like, well, you know, there's so many elements that I could want to just copy over to the new one. That class, even though it has the same class, it adds a hyphen to it. I wish it will recognize that if I already have that class, it would just apply the existing class instead of adding a hyphen, and it minimizes this whole cleanup process.
Yeah, there's actually a new Google Chrome extension by Extom. He was
Okay.
actually here on
Okay.
the call. He created something that when you copy elements to another project with the
Oh,
same
yeah.
process, it kind of like replaces them. So yeah.
Oh, I gotta look into that.
I've seen, oh, 1 second. Steph had a question. I'm new to Webflow and keep hearing about frameworks. Do you use any in particular? Okay, so this is like a huge thing for Webflow people. And I think in general, I personally like to sort of start with FinSuite, but I am not married to it. Like I will also use like my own sauce into it, sort of like what Joe Moore is doing, because some of the components and elements from FinSuite are redundant to me. So yeah, I just kind of I feel like life is all about balance, and when you just like marry to one thing, it's like you're stuck with that, and I don't like that because especially Steph, the type of designs that you make, FinSuite could be really restricting. Now, saying that, I did learn a lot about HTML and CSS by using FinSuite because of the way that they structure their projects makes a lot of sense, and it kind of makes you understand like, oh, okay, now I understand that you have this like global classes and then you add the styling with this other classes into it. But I don't think it's like a deal breaker.
Yeah, frameworks are key. Actually, yesterday I met with a potential client for like a long-term contract, and they're moving from WordPress to Webflow. And when I was talking to them, and they was like, what kind of framework have you decided? And they were like, what do you mean framework? I was like, okay, so you using WordPress, you actually have a theme, like whether it be Drupal or whatever. So it's pretty much the same rule. Framework, in Webflow, you have three, right? You have your FinSuite, which is probably the most popular. Then you have Mass, and obviously Timothy Rick's Loomis. Each of them have a certain level, kind of just like what Melissa just said. FinSuite is probably the easiest to pick up, but it is the heaviest. But you could, once you're done with your project, you could actually delete everything that you don't need. And there's so many tools now that you could add to Webflow that it makes that life a lot easier. Mass, I haven't tried it yet. But Loomis, I've used Loomis a bit, and Loomis is more, I think it's leaning towards more coding than no code. And I think that's what some people are fearing it. But once you learn it, you feel it, you get really comfortable with it.
Yeah. I wouldn't even worry about that at the beginning, Steph.
Yeah.
Like I would just try to understand more how to keep a clean code and how to understand alignment and positioning and all of those things prior to that, because that's going to restrict you. It's the same that on Figma auto layout. Like if you're using auto layout components, like all of that stuff, you're restricting your way of working. And if you're not proficient on it at the beginning, it's just going to slow you down.
Yeah.
So that's
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, because at the moment, just for content, I'm doing like this design that isn't very in the Figma. It's not very structured. Like everything is it's not consistent, the design in every page. So what I've kind of done is doing, just like you said, keeping the class very clean, avoiding combo classes and where I can. But yeah, I just keep hearing people saying, "What framework are you using?" And I'm just like,
Yeah, no. Listen, people on
yeah.
Twitter are always on to the next thing. Like, don't pay attention to that stuff. Like, only pay attention to things that you're super excited about to try. But don't let whatever people on Twitter are saying or like, yeah, because it can get really overwhelming, and honestly, like, it's not necessary.
My advice to everyone who's just starting out with Webflow is two things. One, jump on Webflow University. I believe it's called 101, Webflow University 101. Do the whole series. It's about like 30 to 40 videos. You will learn so much from those videos that Webflow becomes like almost second nature to you. Then from there, you can decide, okay, what are going to be the frameworks that I'm going to use? And they all have great documentation. And if you have some kind of a HTML background, like actually writing code, because that's where I came from. I used to write code before I found Webflow. So I lean towards more Timothy Ricks, where if you look at his Loomis, even before it used to be called Wizardry, it uses a lot of custom code. And but you need to understand how the custom code works, because he hides it so it's not in the way, and you could just concentrate on the actual structure. But once you understand how it works, then you're like, okay, I know how to use a custom div. Like, for example, like Melissa was using the div, and and I'm glad that she actually showed that you have to give it a semantic tag of section, where you could use a custom div that is out now in Webflow, and you could assign tell it to be a section, and then add a custom code and tell it whenever you see the class section, that is always relative.
Yeah,
And
but I just feel like for them that they're just starting, like,
yeah, no, that's what I'm saying. That's something that you want to do like down the road. Let's say like 3 months down the road. Don't jump on that now, because you're going to be lost.
yeah, exactly. Like right now, it's more important I just feel it's so important to understand how things move around in web compared to like say, Figma, because once you get that, you won't have the issues, for example, Steph, about the nav. You know what I mean? So
And Figma did a really good job with dev mode. So if you ever have like doubts how things are built in Figma, remember the Figma is a web application. So it uses HTML, CSS on the back end. So now you actually could go into the development side of Figma, and it gives you a whole breakdown. And then you could now you understand. Now when you look at that breakdown, you could go into Webflow and be like, okay, I understand from the videos. I understand how a div works, and in the blocks, and the box system, right, and the flex, and how everything works. So now by looking at the code in Figma, you can make a decision how you're going to build it in Webflow.
yeah. Yeah, Figma is getting like really, really close to basically like just development, if you use it that way. But like my thing is just that I just love the freedom of design so much that I'm not really thinking about the development part, and I don't want to again be restricted on wrapping everything in a box inside a box, so that I know how to build it on web, which I feel like it could be, it could save a lot of time, but design is so creative and development is so technical that like if you do this every day, at least like enjoy it, or you know, like I like to enjoy it by just being creative and not thinking about the technicalities of how I'm gonna build that.
Yeah. I'll tell you, it took me probably a good year to feel comfortable with Webflow, that I could, if somebody were to ask me, oh, how do I solve this? Or how do I build this? That I'd be like, you know what? I could just do certain builds and do this and use the Flexbox and I could just solve the problem. But to get to that point, you have to do, I always tell people, do like micro projects. Don't do like full pages. Don't go crazy building like 20 pages. Build a page or do like a mini series for yourself, or just do building heroes. And you can make the heroes. You can make simple nav, you could do mega menus, you could do full menus, you could do, and then you can start playing around how you can make items float around. Do like an intro, and it just, that will help you understand how to use the tool of Webflow.
Like what we did with the grid layout, like
Yeah,
that
exactly.
way to.
Yeah, let's say you do like 10 variations of that. By the 10th, or probably not even the 10th, probably by the 5th one, you will know how to use the grid so well that you're going to do kind of like what let's see, what's his name? Oh my God, I can't forget his name right now. But it's like he uses grids inside of grids inside of grids, right? I know
Yeah,
you're talking. I'm trying to remember his name right now, but he releases like a template almost like every month, and
yeah,
his style is really cool.
exactly. So, yeah, I think that we should continue this if you guys liked it. If you guys have other things you feel like maybe you didn't know how it got there, let me know on Discord, on Instagram, on Twitter, whatever. And share your work. Like if you practice, share your work. I was thinking, am I gonna make this clonable? I mean, it's the Eurecah site, so I may not. I may change it a little bit, and then that way you guys can practice. Between Flex and Grid, which to choose? Okay, so I feel like I use grids more for either feature cards, CMS type of like cards, like when you want to show like the services, for example, on cards, or when it's like a complex layout that I want to make sure that I keep it as clean as possible. Clean meaning like I'm not using like padding to position things, or I'm not using the absolute positioning little lever. And Flex, I use it mostly on everything. So when I want something centered, either horizontally or vertically, when it's more like a simple layout is when I like to use Flex. One thing to keep in mind, that I don't know if this is still a thing, but grids on Safari sometimes like glitch out a little bit. So you kind of like have to change them to Flex. But it hasn't happened all the time for me, but I know that it happened a couple times. So that's when I use Flex or Grid. Any other questions? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, when it comes to Flex, if you only have either horizontal or vertical, when it comes to grid, you could do both, and that's the advantage of grid.
Because you have your columns and your rows.
Yeah, yeah. So as long as you remember that, then you could definitely apply the ability of grids almost to everything. And then you could sprinkle Flex inside of grids, and that's why both frameworks worked. Sorry, not both both displays format worked really well together.
Yeah, we can add animation to it, of course. Cool.
All
Okay,
right.
guys. Well, it was a pleasure. Thank you for
Yeah.
coming. I'll see you next week. I'll try to get more stuff prepared so you guys can clone it and practice. And I can't wait to see you, Jason, specifically going from Figma to Webflow. How exciting.
Hi, Melissa. Great seeing you.
Same.
All
Bye.
right. Bye.